Hello everyone and welcome to round 5 of the Norway Chess 2022. It's Viswanathan Anand versus Magnus Carlsen, a match that you guys don't need to ask twice for me to show, and this one you did ask for more than twice and for good reasons as usual. It's a classical game and it's really a wonderful one. Many winning chances. You guys will enjoy it. There will be two pause the video moments because what requires to be solved in this game is definitely not easy. So hope you guys are ready for it. Let's check it out. Anand has the white pieces and the pawn is already on e4. So Magnus replies e5, we have knight to f3, knight to c6 and bishop to c4. Anand goes for the Italian game. Knight to f6, Magnus strikes back with two knights defense and d3, going for the calm modern bishop's opening. Bishop to e7 and both players castle. So castles and rook to e1. So this is all very standard stuff, only top engine moves. d6 and a4, grabbing more space here on the queen side. Knight to a5, Magnus goes after the bishop and bishop back to a2. We have c5, you move the knight, so now you can advance your c-pawn. You grab more space in the center. We have c3 by Anand and knight back to c6 now. Knight to a3 and now pawn to h6. And here bishop to d2 is the most played move here, but Magnus goes for knight to c2, which is not new, it's just a little bit rarer, and now a6 by Anand. We have knight to e3, and here we have bishop to e6, challenging the light square bishop here. This bishop is an incredible piece, so of course we want to counter it. And here Anand plays knight to d5, and this is now a new move, so already as of move 13 we have a completely new game. Let's see how Magnus continues. Rook to e8, he just develops, and knight back to d2. Now this knight could go, let's say, c4 to b6, but that's not going to happen. Of course, the knight is coming to f1, and later on you can remaneuver it to e3 or even g3 if needed. So here b5, Magnus strikes in the center, not just allowing Wishy to remaneuver for free. Knight to f1, and now comes bishop captures on d5. This is one of those moments where you would much rather capture with the knight, but you can't because you would just blunder a piece. And I've seen this happen many times, you know, in bars or libraries where people just blunder pieces. So here bishop captures on d5, bishop captures, knight captures, and pawn captures. So here Anand's d pawn is doubled, but Magnus now has to move the knight from the active c6 square. So knight to a5, and now comes pawn to b4 by Anand. Always a good move, and especially in this position. And Magnus goes back, knight to b7. If you go for trades here, let's say c captures on b4, c captures on b4, and knight to b7. Now you could also play a captures on b5. So this is one way to go about it. Let's say rook captures, queen captures, and now queen to f3. It's a very nice position for Anand. Like I said, the knight can always find a nice square on f5, and if Magnus wants to prevent this, he will have to play g6, weakening the king side even further. Okay, we have b4 first, knight to b7, and now comes rook to e2 by Anand. Again, you could always go for this. It's always in the position, but Anand says let's just keep it close. Let's play rook to e2, and this is a very deep move, as you'll see. So here c captures on b4, c captures, and now Magnus plays a5, and he wants to just trade down everything on the queen side. A captures on b5, we have a captures on b4, and now rook back to b1, saying that now Anand's rook that is on e2, so conveniently placed, will come to b2, and then you will start winning things on the b file. And the best thing to counter this idea is by playing knight to c5. And now if rook captures on b4, we're going to play rook to a1. So you give up a pawn temporarily, but you gain a lot of activity. The queen will also come to a8, and it's not going to be easy for white to withstand all of this. But Magnus played queen to d7. He just threatens to pick up the b5 pawn, and Anand says, be my guest. I really hope you do that, because if you do that, I win the game. If you now capture on b5, I'm going to capture on b4. That's it. You move the queen, I win the knight, game over. So of course Magnus doesn't do that. He plays knight to c5, and now comes just grabbing the pawn. Rook captures on b4, and here Magnus does not have an easy time playing this. Now the b pawn will start marching forward, and it's already on Magnus's half of the board. It's a very unpleasant position to play for black, and you should play rook to b8, rook e to b8, and try to fight this. But Magnus plays queen to f5, and he gives Anand just enough to push for the win if he plays, or rather if he finds the correct idea. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find this incredible move while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on not worrying about the d3 pawn. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is bishop to e3. This is what Anand played, and this is now big trouble for Magnus, because it's not clear how to continue this. I'm just going to give you two continuations that are not as great, and then I'm going to show you what Magnus played. Or rather, maybe it's even better than what Magnus played, but it's very hard to say. So here, one idea is to just disregard the d3 pawn and play rook to b8, because this rook really belongs here. We're still going to capture the knight, and after d captures on c5, play knight to e3. We're going to kick away the queen, and once the queen moves, now we're going to play rook to a4. That's the good stuff. Now we don't have to worry about this pawn because we're attacking the a8 rook. And after rook captures, queen captures, we get this position. We traded down very nicely. Our pawn is defended by the knight. We can just push the queen, push the pawn, and we are going to win this game eventually. So this is not very good for Magnus. The other thing to try is queen captures on d3. And that does seem like a reasonable move. You attack the pawn, why not capture it? The problem is after queen captures and knight captures, attacking the rook, we're going to attack the knight. And once the knight goes back, we're still going to capture it. Captures. Now again, Anand gets two passed pawns, and after this, let's say b6, we're going to play rook 8 to b8. The rook is no longer needed on the a file. Knight to e3. And it's very, very difficult to play this for black. Rook will come somewhere, let's say rook to d8, now comes b7. And it's just very, very difficult. Even some ideas like maybe knight to c4 to a5 to c6 will be very, very problematic for white. Not right away, but at some point, because for the moment, the knight is very nicely placed here, guarding this pawn and preventing the c pawn from being pushed forward. But this is all winning for Anand. So instead, Magnus plays the third option, and that is knight captures on d3. You could also just wait and play rook to a3, but well, it's just too complex of a position. So Magnus plays knight captures on d3, and now we have knight to g3. This is the move that Anand has to play if he wants to win this game. And now, where do you put the queen? Of course, the queen has to keep an eye on the knight, so the only square is g6 or h7. Here we have queen to h7. If you go queen to g6, then even rook to g4 will further harass the queen and put the rook on a very nice attacking g file. So just queen to h7 by Magnus, and now comes rook 4 to b3, now threatening to win the knight. Knight to c5, and now again we trade this bishop for knight. That's why this bishop to e3 was such a crucial idea. Bishop captures, d captures, and now pawn to b6. And the best thing about this position is that Carlsen's queen is completely stuck on h7. There's just no good way to get that queen into the game. Here we have rook e to d8, putting pressure on the d file. Or you could play queen to g6 right away, but just b7 is incredibly strong. We're gonna play the rook here and rook b6, attack the queen again. Just not a lot of squares for that queen. This is guarded by the knight, by the queen, also defended by the queen and by the rook. So it's really. You can put it on g6, but it's not going to do anything there. So here, rook e to d8, and now comes pawn to b7, attacking the rook here, rook 8 to b8, and now rook to b6. Here, you could play a lot of things, but rook to b6 is just beautiful, taking away that last square that the black queen has, and now there really isn't a move for Magnus. Magnus, however, always finds a move, even when there is no move to be found, and he plays c4. He starts pushing his own pass pawn, which also frees up the bishop a little bit, and you have to be a little bit careful of what you play, because the next move is crucial, and this is the one for the records. If Anand finds this one, then everything just falls into place, but it is only if he finds it. So feel free to pause the video and try to find this move, as this one is even harder to spot than the previous one, while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on playing rook to c6. This is what Anand played, but this is not the move that wins the game. The actual move that wins the game is queen to g4. So it's similar to Anand's idea. Anand played rook to c6. He went for the c4 pawn because the c4 pawn is kind of the only counterplay Magnus has here, but it is important to play queen to g4 and go after the pawn this way, because now we're not only threatening to capture the pawn, but also if this knight comes to f5, then well, that's just not a position that you can hold. Let's explore some of the options here. If you play rook captures on d5, and why wouldn't you? It's a free pawn. Then Anand would play h4 first, creating a little bit of breathing room for his king. And you have to be careful. If this rook moves, you don't want to blunder the rook on b1 or something. But now knight to f5 is definitely coming. So here Magnus will play something like h5, kick away the queen, and now we just pick up the pawn. We could play queen captures on c4, but we could also play the cooler queen to c8 check and pick up the pawn this way. Of course, the rook cannot capture. We just bring another queen into the game. So here, rook back to d8, and now queen captures on c4. And now it seems like, okay, maybe you don't have all that much. The problem is this knight. This knight on the c6 square, and that's just unstoppable. To give you an example, let's say queen d3, we can trade queens. Let's say captures, captures. Now comes rook to c6. We are, of course, threatening rook to c8, and once this rook goes back, now we start bringing the knight into the game. Knight f5 attacks the bishop, and the bishop has to keep an eye on the rook here. So it's very hard to find a move. If you play something like bishop to f8, we play rook to c7. And again, no good move for black here. For example, g6, knight to e3, and after any move by black, because black is really out of any useful moves, knight to c4. And now the knight is coming to a5 and c6, and that's of course gonna be game winning. e4, let's say king f1, rook to e8, preparing to push the pawn. Let's say king e2, even better. Rook e7, offering a trade, but now just captures, and now knight to e5. We are getting the c6 square. It's a light square, so there is nothing black can do about this. Whatever black does, knight c6, and that's it. You have to move the rook somewhere. Doesn't really matter where. Rook to c6. We're going to promote the pawn to a queen. After captures, we're just going to capture it, and that's it. We're up a full rook, and of course, completely winning. So that's what happens if you play something like rook captures on d5. But of course, you don't have to do that. You could play the much stronger bishop to c5. Just challenge this rook, get the bishop out of this nasty square. Still doesn't matter, because now we're going to play queen captures on c4. We're going to give up the exchange, and look at this. Bishop captures, rook captures. The queen still cannot get into the game. All of these squares, sorry about that, are covered, and there's just no way to activate the queen. For example, h5, we're going to play h4, not allow the queen to kick away the knight, and after king h8, because you really don't have a move here, now we're just going to start bringing the knight into the game. Let's say queen f5 now, because the f5 square has been vacated, knight to g5 even. And this is just terrible position for black. For example, king g8, we're going to play d6, the other pass pawn is marching forward. g6, we're going to play knight to e4. And after king g7, g3, we're going to play rook to d7. We have to try making some moves, but it's just little by little we improve the position for white. Let's say queen f3, not allowing the knight to jump because the queen would hang. We just play rook to b3, kick away the queen, and after queen to after queen to e2, now we just play knight to c5, and there's just no defending this position. Rook goes back to d8, rook to e3. We're even going to win this pawn, and that's it. There's no counterplay here. Queen b2, rook captures on e5, and the two pass pawns will just be too much for black to handle. So it's a lot of moves, but it just works. The problem is after c4, Anand did not play queen to g4. Anand played the other one, rook to c6, which I'm sure some of you found as well, as it goes after the c4 pawn. But now Magnus has this move that allows him to activate the queen, and that is queen to d3. That's also one of the reasons c4 was played, to grab control over the d3 square. And now especially you can't really move the queen anywhere since Anand moved the rook, because the rook on b1 would hang. So what can you do here? Anand still has some pressure if he captures the queen. For example, king to f1, and now you have to be very careful. For example, if you capture this pawn, it's game over after knight to f5. The bishop needs to keep an eye on this square in order to defend, and there's just no good move to do it. If you play bishop back to f8, then you lose control of this square, and if you try something like bishop to f6 to keep an eye on this square, then we just pick up the bishop. Captures, knight e7 check, picks up the rook, and it's game over. So what you would have to do after king f1 is actually play bishop to f8, only way to continue the game. Now rook c7, and Anand will just have very, very annoying pressure here all the time. Rook captures on d5, king e1, we're going to play rook c5, offer a rook trade, captures, we're going to play king to d2, and it's an incredibly complicated position, but at the end of the day, it's a pass pawn on b7, which is a light square, and you can't do all that much about it with the dark square bishop, and the rook can never move from the back rank. So this was still the way to kind of put some pressure, but after queen to f1, now it's much easier for Carlsen to equalize. He puts the bishop on f8, and now all of the secrets that were in the position are no longer there. So here rook captures on c4, grabbing that pawn. Now it's possible. Queen captures on f1 with check, king captures, and now rook to d7, putting pressure on the b7 pawn. Rook to c8 now, attacking the rook here, and now rook b captures on b7. We have rook captures on b7, rook captures, and knight to f5 now. So still some pressure, but it is not enough. The material on the board is equal, and not enough to push. We have rook to d7. Now comes g4, and here, of course, you don't capture the rook. The pawn, if you capture the pawn, knight e7 just wins the game. The bishop is pinned. So after g4, we have pawn to g6, and now knight captures on h6, as the bishop, of course, cannot move, but he was also in this position on move 40 that Anand and Carlsen agreed to a draw, as there is nothing more to be done here. It's just a draw, and that's just it. For example, if king h7, we're going to play captures on here, captures here, and that's it. It's a rook endgame, very easily drawn. For example, you're going to play h4, f5, captures, and now rook captures on d5, and of course this is now a draw. We could play a few more moves, f4, as the pawn cannot move, king g6 attacks the rook g5 check, king f6, king to g2, we bring the king into the game, rook d2 check, king g3, and now after captures, of course, this is now a draw. Rook f2 check, we push the king back, rook a2, we're going to start checking the white king, and there's no way to win this, of course. So yeah, after knight captures on h6, the players agree to a draw, and what an amazing game between these two world elite players, both of them world champions in classical chess, and it's just remarkable. So Anand spotted after Carlsen's queen to f5, which is essentially a blunder, this incredible bishop to e3 idea, but in a position where it's hard to find the move, but this c4, very nice resourcefulness by Magnus, just creating that outpost for the queen on d3, and queen to g4, the only way to push this for a win, because it just gains control of this, you push pressure here, you can play knight to f5, you put pressure on c8, so all of this is just in the position, and well, it's basically the only move that allowed Anand to win the game. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Sorry for a bit of a longer video, but the lines required it. So hope you enjoyed that as well. I would like to thank Varun Sudarsanan, Richard Knapp, Raymond Young, Cedra Simmons, and David Kimura for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this wonderful event until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.